Today on America's Test Kitchen, Brian uncovers the secrets to the perfect broiled pork tenderloin. Adam reviews wine savers in the equipment corner, and Julia cooks rice and lentils with crispy onions. Right here on America's Test Kitchen.
Back in the early 1970s, I was going to school in New York, and one of my friends was sitting in as the drummer for the Velvet Underground. So we headed over to Max's Kansas City. Of course, I heard them play Take a Walk on the Wild Side. Now, back then, it meant one thing. Fast forward 50 years later here in the test kitchen, it means something quite different. It means using the broiler. There's a lot of heat, it's very unpredictable, and you end up doing one of two things. You get the outside nice and brown. This is a pork tenderloin, but the inside is overcooked. This one, the outside really isn't brown enough, although the inside is perfectly cooked. So let's head into the kitchen with Brian. We're going to take a broiler and a couple of pork tenderloins, and then we're going to take a walk on the wild side. You know, I get this question almost every week, so I thought we'd resolve the question today once and for all. I noticed on your show, America's Test Kitchen, you have people in the background working. Are they really working, or are they just props? So let's just ask, are you guys props, or are you really working? We're working. They're kind of working.
All right, back to work.
That wasn't so strong. Anyway, we got that resolved. Let's move on to the tenderloin. It's now your turn to work.
Right. So I have two 16-ounce pork tenderloins here. For years in the test kitchen, we've been searing tenderloin off in a skillet. Now we thought maybe there's an easier way to do it. Why don't we use the broiler? It's one of the most useful, underused pieces of equipment in the kitchen. It offers a lot of good browning if you can harness all that radiant heat. We figured that out.
So you get a better crust.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. So this one has already been cleaned, and I'm going to show you how to clean off the silver skin and sinew from this pork tenderloin. Okay, I'm just going to work my boning knife up underneath the edge of the silver skin, pull it taut against the blade of the knife, and just kind of saw it back and forth until it comes off nice and easily.
You do a good job. I tend to take about half the tenderloin off when I do that sometimes.
Yeah, well, the key is pulling the silver skin tight and pushing the knife up against it.
Okay.
It's like one rule of butchering. You always cut the bone, not the meat, in this case, the silver skin. Okay, so the tenderloins are clean. And you notice that there is a skinny tapered end called the tail in the tenderloin. Mm-hmm. And that is obviously going to cook much more quickly than the rest of the tenderloin. So what we're going to do is we're going to tuck under about 2 inches of that tail so it looks about the same as the rest. And secure it with a piece of kitchen twine. Okay, and then we're going to continue to tie the tenderloin at about 2-inch intervals all the way down, just to make it very consistent and even.
So you'll have a lot of heat from the broiler, and so everything has to be the same thickness, so otherwise you get overcooked meat.
Correct.
Okay.
And we'll go through and trim off any of this excess string hanging off the end so it doesn't burn underneath the broiler. All right, we're going to go ahead and tie this second tenderloin, which has already been trimmed. All right, Chris, so we have our tenderloins tied up, and we're going to use another trick that we commonly use in the test kitchen, and that's our friend baking soda. So we're going to combine 2 teaspoons of kosher salt, a half teaspoon of black pepper, and 1 1/4 teaspoons of vegetable oil. We're just going to mix that together first, and this is really just to make sure the salt is wet and there's no clumping. Then we're going to go ahead and add a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. Just mix that in. And now we're going to go ahead and rub the tenderloins down with the baking soda mixture. What it does on the surface of the meat, it creates an alkaline environment which promotes the Maillard reaction, which is all that flavorful browning that will give us a nice crust,
so
nice taste.
Baking soda, more browning.
Right.
Okay.
So Chris, our last and final trick for this recipe was to harness the radiant heat of the broiler. Typically we'd put this on a wire rack and a rim baking sheet, but then that radiant heat just goes all over the oven. So I'm going to put the tenderloins in this aluminum pan, which is obviously very reflective. We used a 13 by 9 inch disposable aluminum pan with reflective 3-inch sides to really redirect that radiant heat towards the tenderloins. And that combined with the baking soda helps the tenderloin brown very nicely. Okay. So I have an oven set up with the rack set to about 4 to 5 inches from the broiler element. The oven has been preheated to 325 degrees, but just before I put the pork in there, I'm going to switch it to broil. So the pork gently starts cooking while the broiler element starts to heat up.
Okay. So broilers are tricky to use, but this technique with a disposable pan actually solves a lot of the problems, and here's why. Well, here's how cooking works. Molecules speed up, there's a lot of energy, and heat is released. Now, that's most efficient when you have, let's say, a skillet. It's metal, conducts heat, let's say, to the steak. The molecules bump into each other. The outside of the steak, the bottom, starts to get hot, and that transfers heat to the center through conduction. Water also has a lot of molecules, so that's fairly efficient. The oven's not. Air doesn't have a lot of molecules compared to water or metal, and that's why it takes much longer to cook things in the oven. That brings us to the broiler, which are infrared waves. It's a different system of cooking. It's just above visible light, slightly longer wavelength. In fact, broilers turn orange or red just at the cusp of infrared and visible light. The problem with the broiler is it's like a light bulb. Up close, it's very bright and hot. Far away, it's cooler. So the distance from the broiler makes a big difference. And those waves go all throughout the oven, heat everything up. It's kind of chaotic. So using a pan, it concentrates those waves right around the two tenderloins we have, which gives you much more even cooking.
Okay, Chris, let's take a look at these tenderloins and we'll temp them. All right, it's at about 129 degrees, which is perfect for what we need. This will carry over easily about 10 degrees.
Okay.
But we're just going to let it rest for about 10 minutes, cover it with some foil, and we're going to make a quick salsa to go with it. So I have a quarter cup of sun-dried tomatoes that have been minced, a quarter cup of chopped fresh parsley, about a quarter cup of basil here. Okay, then we're going to add a quarter cup of extra virgin olive oil, a small shallot that's been minced, and 2 tablespoons of balsamic vinegar. Just give that a stir. So this salsa's got a nice little bit of acidity to it that's going to go really well with the pork. I haven't added any salt and pepper to this yet, so I know it'll take a fair amount. The tenderloins have been resting for about 10 minutes. You can go ahead and start taking the strings off. So Chris, any words? Or?
They look great. I mean, the one thing I obviously noticed is the outside got exactly the kind of browning you wanted.
Right.
But we have to check the inside too, see if they're overcooked.
All right, so now we can go ahead and cut them into approximate half-inch slices. Okay, can I give you some of this salsa?
Lots of the salsa. That's the veg. It looks perfectly
Right,
cooked, but-
and carry over nice.
I really hate to compliment you because I know you'll be.
Oh.
The head gets bigger, but
Every
this is
year.
perfectly cooked. I mean, it is absolutely perfectly cooked. It's tender. It's not dried out on the outside, which is a big problem with a thin cut of meat. Pork tenderloin's so lean too, and the broiler. I mean, it is definitely risky business. High heat, lean piece of meat that's not too thick. You have to do it just right.
And that salsa's got a really nice acidity and some subtle sweetness to it that really complements the pork, huh?
Yes, Brian. Nice selection. No, it is perfect with the pork. The pork is perfectly cooked. So, the secrets to great broiled pork tenderloin start with 2 pork tenderloins. But the thin ends, the flaps, were pulled back 2 inches and tied up so it's exactly the same diameter throughout. Baking soda on the outside, which helps the Maillard reaction for browning, and that disposable pan which concentrated the infrared waves right on the meat. The oven was preheated at 325 just before we put them in, about 4 inches below the broiler. You turned it onto broiler. So initial cooking, and then as it heated up, we finally got great browning on the outside. So from America's Test Kitchen to your kitchen, a perfect and foolproof method for doing great broiled pork tenderloin. Nice job.
Thank you.
You can come back anytime. So it's the end of the evening, you have half a bottle of wine, and now you have 3 choices. You can drink the other half, you can somehow store it with a wine storage system, or just throw the cork back in and hope for the best. The latter is not a great idea because the oxygen will oxidize the wine, and it doesn't even hold to the next day. So the question is, what's the smart solution?
The smart solution, well, my solution at home is I will just pour the wine into a smaller bottle or a smaller container that will limit the oxygen exposure and drink it the next day. That's if I don't drink it that night. But there are different wine preservation systems. This is what we've used for years, and it's what I use at home. This is the VacuVin Wine Saver, and it's a vacuum pump. It comes with 2 of these corks that you put in the open bottle, and you put the pump on the top, and you pump out the air. So there's no oxygen left in there. It's a vacuum. You're good to go. It has competition. We have 5 different models here. The prices range from $9 to, fasten your seatbelts.
This is bad.
You know this
$100,
one.
$300.
$300
I knew it was a few
for
hundred,
this.
yeah.
This is the Coravin Wine Access System, and this is the expensive one. And the way it works is it's got a little hollow tube that actually goes right through the cork.
Very,
Put it on the
very
top like
narrow
that.
diameter.
Very, very narrow diameter because you pour through it and you press it down like so. And then you pour. Here, tip the bottle, press that little tube. You can pour out of the tube that's in the cork, and that will shoot inert argon gas into the bottle where oxygen was. There's another system here. This is called the Air Cork Wine Preserver, and it's an inflatable latex balloon that you put in the open bottle. You use this cluster of grapes, which is a pump, to pump up the balloon and limit the exposure to oxygen that way.
This looks like an accessory for the Barbie house from Mattel or something they decided to turn into a wine saver.
It does look like a children's toy. We have 3 other systems here. This is a can of inert gas that you just spray into the open bottle. The gas is heavier than the oxygen, so it forces the oxygen out and sits on the surface of the wine. This one is a carafe that has a little plastic insert with a silicone perimeter, and that keeps oxygen away from the wine. And then when you tip it, you can pour out of it because the plastic insert moves.
Ingenious.
And then this one is another vacuum pump. This one has a fancy little gauge that will tell you where your vacuum is at. We tested these on half bottles of red wine and white wine with an in-house tasting panel, and we actually have a wine expert on staff, so we made sure that they were involved also. 3 of them we didn't really like at all. They just didn't do that great a job. That's these 3, so we're going to get rid of those.
Okay.
The other ones did a pretty decent job. In fact, this wine access system kept the wine tasting fresh up to 2 months now, and we're still counting. We have a couple of gripes with this, though. The price, it's $300. It doesn't work quite as well with synthetic corks as it does with natural cork. It doesn't work at all on screw top bottles. And each gas cartridge is good for 5 uses, and then it's about $11 to replace it.
So I have seen this actually in New York at a restaurant where they poured just 1 glass of wine. It was an expensive bottle of wine. And then they just put it back in storage. So how does that work when you put it back in storage?
Well, you actually pull this out of the cork, and the cork will seal itself up. And there's that inert gas in there, so there's no oxygen, and you can reuse this on another bottle. And the manufacturer says that you can keep wine tasting fresh for ages, and we're up to 2 months.
So it seals itself because the diameter of that needle that goes in is so thin.
It's very slender, very, very slender. So this is our winner. If you want a budget-friendly choice, you can also get the Air Cork Wine Preserver, $25. Each balloon is good for 80 uses, and to replace it is about $5. We're up to a month, and the wine still tastes fine.
So a relatively cheap option is to take the Air Cork Wine Preserver. It's a little silly looking, but keeps the wine fresh for up to a month. If you have $300 and nothing else to do, buy the Coravin, and that will keep the wine fresh maybe for years. You'll find out.
I will find out. We'll keep tasting.
Once in a while, it's nice to be honest here in the Test Kitchen.
Once in a while?
Once a year. So this is my time to be honest. In America, we don't do a great job with vegetables, grains, legumes, for example.
I agree.
We call them side dishes.
I know.
Which means they're not that important. Most other cultures in the world do take them seriously, and there's a great dish called majutra, which comes from the Arabs in the 13th century. It means pockmark, which means little pieces of lentils against the background of rice. And it also has crispy fried onions on the top. In fact, I've actually had it as a main course. It's so good. The problem is you got to cook the rice and lentils exactly right, and the fried onions are kind of a mess.
Yeah, totally.
So that's your job, in all honesty, to fix those problems.
Yep, so we're going to start with the fried onions because that really is the hallmark flavor of this dish. And we're not talking about just an onion or two, we're talking about 2 pounds of onions. But the problem is you really want to deep fry these in oil. That way they get nice and evenly softened and they don't get dry and leathery and they get nice and caramelized. But for this many onions, deep frying them, it takes at least an hour. It takes lots of oil. So our first step was to simplify the process. So we're going to slice these onions into 1/4 inch thick slices. When you deep fry something like an onion, it has a lot of moisture inside. And so a lot of that frying time, you're just waiting for that moisture to evaporate before things can start to brown. So if you could get the moisture out of the onions before you start frying, you'll shave off a lot of time.
Something's coming.